The asphalt of Clearwater Elementary didn't just crack under the weight, it surrendered completely. 32 Harley Davidson motorcycles, each one 1,000 pounds of chrome and American steel, rolled into the school parking lot like thunder given form. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a physical force that rattled the windows of the brick building, shook the flagpole, and silenced every conversation in the schoolyard. Parents froze mid-sentence, their plastic cups of lemonade trembling in their hands. Teachers dropped their clipboards. The volunteer DJ cut the music. And Caleb Voss, a thick-shouldered 10-year-old boy who had spent the last 6 months making 8-year-old Rosie Miller's life a living nightmare, backed slowly against the chain-link fence until the metal bit into his spine. Through the cloud of exhaust and Montana dust, a line of men dismounted. They wore heavy leather vests, dark sunglasses, and boots that had walked 1,000 miles of bad road. The patches on their backs were unmistakable. The winged death's head skull, the rocker that read Montana, the bottom rocker that simply said Hell's Angels. And the biggest man of them all, a mountain with a gray streaked beard and shoulders like a cliff face, walked straight past the principal, past the shocked parents, past the sheriff's deputy who had his hand frozen halfway to his service weapon. He stopped in front of a tiny girl with wild auburn hair and a purple bruise spreading across her left cheekbone like spilled ink. The little girl looked up at him with one good eye and one swollen shut, and the massive biker knelt down on the freshly mowed grass, bringing himself to her level. "Hey, Rosie," he said, his voice like gravel tumbling in a cement mixer. "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Traffic was hell on the interstate." The little girl's face, tense with anxiety and barely contained tears, broke into the brightest smile Montana had seen in years. She reached out with small, trembling hands and grabbed onto the biker's leather vest like it was a life raft in a storm. "You came," she whispered. "You really came, Hawk." August Brennan Road name Hawk, president of the Montana charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, wrapped one massive tattooed arm around the little girl and lifted her effortlessly onto his shoulders. He turned to face the crowd of stunned parents and the furious red-faced man in a sheriff's uniform standing near the refreshment table. Now, Hawk said, his voice carrying across the silent yard with the authority of a man who had led Marines through hell and lived to tell about it. "Which one of you good folks is running this father-daughter rodeo? Because my girl here tells me there's a dance competition, and I got my boots polished special." 6 weeks earlier, the Montana sky had been the same impossible blue it always was in late August, the kind of blue that made you believe in something bigger than yourself. But Rosie Miller, sitting on the splintered wooden steps of the Desert Rose Trailer Park, couldn't see the beauty in it. All she could see was the calendar page tacked to the inside of their trailer door, the one with the father-daughter rodeo, circled in red marker, the date looming like an execution. Rosie was 8 years old, small for her age, with a wild tangle of auburn hair that her mother Grace tried and failed to tame every morning. Her knees were perpetually scraped from falling off her secondhand bicycle. Her clothes were Goodwill finds, carefully washed and mended by Grace's tired hands. But the thing people noticed first about Rosie Miller wasn't her hand-me-down clothes or her tangled hair, it was her eyes. Green as Montana pine trees, sharp and watchful, the eyes of a child who had learned too young that the world was not a safe place. The bruise on her cheek was 3 days old. It had started as a violent red, the exact shape of a man's knuckles, and had since ripened into a sickly purple yellow that made her look like she'd been in a car accident. She traced the edge of it with her fingertips, wincing at the tender flesh. Dale Thornton, her mother's boyfriend of 14 months, had delivered the backhand 2 nights ago when Rosie had tried to stop him from taking the grocery money out of Grace's purse. Dale wasn't supposed to live with them. He had his own apartment in town, a bachelor pad that smelled of stale beer and gun oil, but he'd been staying over more and more, and when he drank, which was most nights, his voice got louder and his hands got heavier. Grace had apologized to Rosie after crying in the tiny bathroom, pressing a bag of frozen peas to her daughter's face, but Grace hadn't kicked Dale out. She never did, because Dale Thornton was a sheriff's deputy and Grace Miller was terrified of what he might do if she tried to leave him. Rosie pulled her knees tighter to her chest and watched the traffic on Highway 87. The Desert Rose Trailer Park sat on the edge of Clearwater, Montana, a town of 4,200 people nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the Sunday church service was social currency, and where a single mother working 2 jobs to support her kid was looked at with a mixture of pity and judgment. Grace worked the morning shift at the Highway Haven Diner, slinging eggs and coffee from 5 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon. Then she worked the evening shift at the Clearwater Public Library, shelving books and checking out returns until closing at 8. Rosie spent her days at school and her afternoons at the library doing homework in the back corner while her mother worked. It wasn't much of a life, but it had been theirs and it had been safe. Until Dale. A rusted Chevy pickup truck rattled into the trailer park, kicking up a cloud of dust. Rosie's stomach clenched. She recognized that truck. Dale was home early. She heard his heavy boots on the gravel, heard him yelling for Grace, even though he knew she was at work. The trailer door slammed open, then slammed shut. Then there was silence, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath. Rosie stayed on the steps. She had learned that making herself small and invisible was the best strategy when Dale was in one of his moods. After about 10 minutes, Dale came back out carrying a six-pack of beer he'd taken from the refrigerator. He didn't even glance at Rosie as he climbed back into his truck and peeled out of the lot. When Grace came home that evening, exhausted and smelling of industrial cleaner and old books, Rosie was waiting at the small dinette table. Grace saw her daughter's face and froze. The bruise had darkened, and Rosie's left eye was now almost completely swollen shut. "Baby," Grace whispered, dropping her purse and rushing over. "Did you put ice on it like I told you?" Rosie nodded. It doesn't hurt that bad, Mama." Grace knelt down, her eyes filling with tears. She was 32, but looked older, worn down by years of single motherhood and the kind of poverty that ground you into dust. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. "I'm going to talk to him," Grace said, but her voice wavered. "I'm going to tell him he can't do this. He can't put his hands on you." Rosie looked at her mother and saw the fear there, the same fear she felt every time Dale's truck pulled into the lot. Grace wasn't going to stand up to Dale. She wanted to. Rosie knew that, but she was too scared, and Rosie couldn't blame her. Dale carried a gun. Dale had a badge. Dale had told them more than once that if they ever tried to leave him, if they ever told anyone what happened behind closed doors, he would make their lives hell. "It's okay, Mama," Rosie said quietly. "I'm okay." But she wasn't okay. And the father-daughter rodeo was in 6 weeks, and Rosie had exactly 0 fathers to bring, and Caleb Voss had promised her in front of the entire 3rd grade class that if she showed up alone again this year, he was going to make her regret it. Rosie Miller's biological father was named Barrett Miller, and he had been a good man once. Grace kept a photo of him on her nightstand, a young man in marine dress blues, square-jawed and serious with Rosie's same green eyes. Barrett had served 2 tours in the Gulf War, had come home with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts. He'd tried to be a good husband and father. He'd gotten a job at the lumber mill, had built Rosie a wooden rocking horse with his own hands, had read her bedtime stories in a voice still rough from shouting orders over helicopter blades. But the ghosts had been louder than his love. When Rosie was 5 years old, Barrett Miller had walked into the garage, closed the door, started his truck, and let the carbon monoxide take him somewhere his nightmares couldn't follow. Grace had found him. Rosie had been at kindergarten. They'd told her at the funeral that Daddy had gotten sick and gone to heaven, but Rosie had overheard enough whispered conversations to piece together the truth. Her father had killed himself. And Grace, suddenly a widow with a 5-year-old and no life insurance because suicide voided, the policy had fallen into the kind of poverty that swallowed families whole. She'd lost the house, she'd lost the truck. They'd ended up in the Desert Rose trailer park in a tin can that rattled when the wind blew and leaked when it rained. And Grace, desperate and lonely, had eventually let Dale Thornton into their lives. The weeks crawled by. Rosie went to school every day with her bruise fading from purple to green to a sickly yellow. The other kids stared but didn't say anything. The teachers noticed but didn't ask. This was Montana, a place where people minded their own business, where a man's home was his castle, even if that castle was a rusted trailer, and where interfering in someone else's family affairs was a good way to make enemies. But Caleb Voss didn't mind his own business. Caleb was the kind of bully who had been raised by a bully who had learned cruelty at his father's knee and perfected it on the playground. His father, Sheriff Raymond Voss, was a man who wore his badge like a crown and ruled Clearwater with an iron fist wrapped in a thin veneer of small-town charm. Sheriff Voss was 52, broad-shouldered with a silver crew cut and cold gray eyes that missed nothing. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, and in that time he'd consolidated power, silenced opposition, and built a network of corruption that stretched from the county courthouse to the state capitol. And his son, Caleb, 10 years old and already mean as a snake, had inherited his father's worst traits. Caleb targeted the weak, the poor, the different. And Rosie Miller, with her secondhand clothes and her missing father and her black eye that everyone pretended not to see, was the perfect victim. It started small, Caleb tripping Rosie in the lunch line, Caleb knocking her books out of her hands in the hallway, Caleb spreading rumors that her mother was a drunk, that her father had been a coward, that Rosie was trash from the trailer park and would never be anything else. Rosie tried to ignore it. She tried to be invisible, but invisibility only worked if the predator wasn't actively hunting you. 3 weeks before the father-daughter rodeo, Caleb cornered Rosie behind the gym during recess. He had two of his friends with him, boys who followed him like remora fish trailing a shark. Caleb grabbed Rosie's backpack and dumped it out onto the dirt, her books, her pencils, her lunch all scattered across the ground. "You gonna bring your daddy to the rodeo this year, Miller?" Caleb sneered, looming over her. "Oh, wait, you can't, because your daddy blew his brains out in a garage, didn't he?" Rosie felt something hot and sharp twist in her chest. Shame, rage, grief. She balled her small fists and swung at Caleb, catching him on the jaw. It wasn't a hard punch. She was 8 and tiny and didn't know how to throw a punch. But it surprised him, and his friends laughed, and that was worse than the punch. Caleb's face went red. He shoved Rosie hard, and she fell backwards, her head cracking against the brick wall of the gym. Stars exploded in her vision. She tasted blood. And Caleb leaned down his face inches from hers and whispered, "You show up to that rodeo without a dad, I'm going to beat you so bad your mama won't recognize you." Rosie went home that day with a knot on the back of her head and blood dried in her hair. Grace cried and held ice to the bump and asked what happened, and Rosie lied and said she'd fallen off the monkey bars, because what was Grace going to do? Call the sheriff? Sheriff Voss was Caleb's father. Call the school. The principal was Sheriff Voss's poker buddy. There was no one to call, no one who would help. That night, Rosie lay in her narrow bed in the tiny room she called hers, separated from her mother's room by a thin particle board wall, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to the father-daughter rodeo. She would fake being sick. She would hide. She would do anything to avoid the humiliation of showing up alone and giving Caleb Voss the satisfaction of destroying her in front of the entire town. But fate, or maybe just bad timing, had other plans. 2 weeks before the rodeo, Dale came home drunk and angry. Grace had refused to lend him money for a poker game, and Dale didn't take no for an answer. Rosie heard the yelling from her room, heard the sound of something breaking, heard her mother cry out. She ran into the living room and saw Dale with his hand wrapped around Grace's throat, slamming her against the wall. Rosie didn't think, she just moved. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy ceramic lamp, and swung it at Dale's back. It shattered against his shoulder blade, and Dale roared, letting Grace go and spinning around. His face was twisted with rage, and before Rosie could run, his fist caught her across the face. The world went white, then black, then came back in fragments. Rosie was on the floor, her face was on fire, Grace was screaming, and Dale was standing over her, his fist still clenched, breathing hard. For a moment, Rosie thought he was going to hit her again, but Grace threw herself between them, begging, pleading, promising she'd get him the money, promising she'd do whatever he wanted, just please don't hurt Rosie. Dale looked at Grace, then at Rosie, then at his own hand, like he was surprised by what it had done. He turned and walked out of the trailer without a word. Grace gathered Rosie into her arms and sobbed, rocking her back and forth like she was a baby, and Rosie, her face swelling, her eye already turning purple, whispered, "I'm okay, Mama, I'm okay." But she wasn't okay, and the next morning when she looked in the mirror and saw the horrific bruise spreading across half her face, she knew she couldn't hide anymore. She couldn't make herself invisible. She couldn't pretend everything was fine. Something had to change. That Saturday, Grace had a rare day off from both jobs, and she asked Rosie if she wanted to go for a drive, maybe get ice cream in the next town over, just the two of them. Rosie agreed, grateful for any excuse to get out of the trailer park. They piled into Grace's ancient Honda Civic, the one that coughed black smoke and had a passenger door held shut with a bungee cord, and they drove north on Highway 87. They stopped at a place called Red's Roadside, a combination gas station diner and biker bar that sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and sky. Grace needed to use the restroom and told Rosie to wait in the car, but Rosie was restless and got out to stretch her legs. She wandered to the edge of the gravel parking lot and sat down on an old tractor tire that had been repurposed as a planter, now full of dead weeds. The heat shimmered off the asphalt. A few big rigs were parked in the lot, their engines ticking as they cooled, and then Rosie heard it. A sound that started as a distant rumble and grew into a roar. She looked down the highway and saw them coming. Motorcycles. Not one or two, but a whole pack riding in formation, their chrome glinting in the Montana sun. They turned into Red's Roadside and pulled into the far end of the lot, away from the trucks. There were 6 of them. Big men on big bikes, dressed in leather and denim, their vests marked with patches Rosie didn't understand. They killed their engines one by one, and the sudden silence was almost as loud as the noise had been. They dismounted, stretching road-stiff muscles, and one of them pulled out a pack of cigarettes. Rosie watched them with wide eyes. She'd seen bikers before, of course. Montana was full of them in the summer, riding through on their way to Sturgis or Glacier Park. But these men were different. They moved with a kind of coiled tension, like wolves pretending to be dogs. And their vests all had the same patch on the back. A skull with wings, words she could just barely make out. Hell's Angels. The biggest man in the group, the one who seemed to be the leader, walked toward the diner. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders like a linebacker and arms covered in faded tattoos. His hair was dark with streaks of gray pulled back in a ponytail, and his beard was thick and shot through with silver. He wore dark sunglasses despite the fact that the sun was starting to sink and his boots were scarred and dusty. As he walked past Rosie, he paused. He turned his head and looked at her. Even through the dark lenses of his sunglasses, she could feel the weight of his gaze. It settled on her face, specifically on the massive bruise that covered her left cheek and eye. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the man reached up and took off his sunglasses, and Rosie saw his eyes. They were pale blue, the color of winter ice, and they were looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity, something harder than that, something colder. "You okay, kid?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough, like he'd spent years shouting over motorcycle engines. Rosie nodded quickly, pulling her knees up to her chest in an instinctive defensive posture. The man studied her for another moment, then nodded and continued into the diner. Rosie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Grace came out of the restroom a few minutes later, and they got back in the car. But as they were pulling out of the parking lot, Rosie looked back and saw the big biker standing outside the diner talking to his friends. He was pointing in the direction of town, and one of the other men was shaking his head. They looked serious and tense, like they were planning something. And then they were gone, disappearing into the rearview mirror as Grace drove them back toward Clearwater. Rosie didn't think much about the encounter for the next few days. She had bigger problems. The father-daughter rodeo was a week away, and Caleb Voss had started a countdown in front of the entire third grade class. 7 days until Trailer Trash Miller gets what's coming to her. He'd announced during lunch, and his friends had laughed and high-fived him while the teacher pretended not to hear. Rosie had stopped sleeping. She lay awake at night staring at the water-stained ceiling of her room, trying to figure out a way to survive the rodeo. She thought about running away. She thought about faking appendicitis. She even thought in her darkest moments about what her father had done in that garage and whether maybe he'd had the right idea after all. But then 3 days before the rodeo, something happened that would change everything. Dale came home in the middle of the day, drunk and furious. He'd been suspended from the sheriff's department, pending an investigation into missing evidence from the lockup. Someone had accused him of skimming confiscated money, and while it was true and everyone knew it, Dale was enraged that someone had actually dared to say it out loud. He stormed into the trailer, found Grace folding laundry, and started yelling. Rosie was supposed to be at the library, but she'd been sent home early because of a teacher work day, and she was hiding in her room, listening to Dale's voice get louder and uglier. She heard him accuse Grace of talking to his supervisor. She heard him call her names that made Rosie's skin crawl. She heard the sound of him grabbing Grace and Grace crying out. And Rosie, small and scared and 8 years old, made a decision she wasn't going to hide anymore. She walked out of her room and stood in the doorway to the living room. Dale had Grace pinned against the kitchen counter, his face inches from hers, one hand wrapped in her hair. "Let her go," Rosie said. Her voice was small but steady. Dale turned and looked at her like he'd forgotten she existed. "What did you say, you little brat?" Rosie's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, but she stood her ground. "I said let her go. Don't touch my mama." Dale released Grace and turned to face Rosie fully. He was swaying, slightly drunk and unstable, and there was something wild in his eyes. "You think you can talk to me like that in my house?" "It's not your house," Rosie said, her voice shaking now. "It's ours, and you need to leave." What happened next happened fast. Dale crossed the small living room in 3 strides. He grabbed Rosie by the arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He raised his other hand, and Rosie saw the fist coming, saw it pull back like a hammer cocking, and she closed her eyes and waited for the impact. It never came. There was a crash, the sound of the trailer door being kicked open with enough force to tear it half off its hinges. Rosie opened her eyes and saw Grace standing there with a tire iron in her hands, breathing hard, her face pale but determined. Dale turned, still holding Rosie, and laughed. "You gonna hit me with that, Gracie? You don't have the guts." Grace didn't hit him, but she didn't back down either. "You put my daughter down and you get out of my home, Dale Thornton, right now, or I swear to God I'll call your captain and tell him every single thing you've done to us." Dale's face went red, then purple. He shoved Rosie away from him, and she stumbled and fell. He took a step toward Grace, and for a moment Rosie thought he was going to kill her mother right there in their tiny living room. But then something shifted in Dale's eyes. Calculation. He looked at Grace, then at Rosie, then back at Grace. He smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Rosie had ever seen. "You call my captain, you'll regret it," he said softly. "I know people, Grace. I know judges. I know child services. You make trouble for me. I'll make sure you lose that kid. I'll make sure they put her in foster care where she belongs with a mama who can actually take care of her." Grace's hands tightened on the tire iron, but Rosie could see the fear creeping back into her mother's eyes. Dale saw it too. He straightened his shirt, picked up his keys from the counter, and walked out of the trailer like nothing had happened. Grace dropped the tire iron and collapsed on the floor, sobbing. Rosie crawled over to her mother and held her while she cried. And in that moment, Rosie understood something fundamental about the world. There was no one coming to save them. The sheriff was corrupt. The system was rigged. The adults who were supposed to protect children were either too scared or too complicit to do anything. If Rosie and Grace were going to survive, they had to save themselves. That night, after Grace had cried herself to exhaustion and fallen asleep on the couch, Rosie sat at the dinette table and thought, the father-daughter rodeo was in 3 days. Caleb Voss was going to be there with his father, the sheriff. Dale Thornton would probably show up drunk and looking for a fight, and Rosie would be alone, vulnerable, the perfect target for everyone who wanted to hurt her, unless she wasn't alone. The thought came to her suddenly fully formed. She thought about the big biker at Red's roadside, the one with the winter pale eyes who had looked at her bruise like he was memorizing it. She thought about the way he and his friends had moved confident and dangerous like men who didn't answer to anyone. She thought about the patches on their backs. Hell's Angels. It was insane. It was desperate. It was the kind of plan an 8-year-old with no other options would come up with. But Rosie was out of options, so she made a decision. Tomorrow after school, she was going back to Red's roadside. And if those bikers were there, she was going to ask them for help. She was going to ask one of them to be her father just for one day. The next afternoon, Rosie told Grace she was going to the library to study. Instead, she took her bicycle, the rusty red one with the bent wheel and the torn seat, and she pedaled north on the shoulder of Highway 87. It took her almost an hour, and by the time she reached Red's roadside, her legs were burning and she was soaked with sweat. She leaned her bike against the side of the building and walked around to the parking lot. There were 3 motorcycles parked near the diner entrance, big chrome-covered machines that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Rosie's heart hammered in her chest. She walked up to the diner door and pushed it open. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee and fried food. There were a few truckers in the booths, and at the counter, sitting on stools with their backs to her, were 3 men in leather vests. Rosie recognized the biggest one immediately, the leader, the one with the winter-colored eyes. He was eating a burger and talking to his companions in a low voice. Rosie stood just inside the door, frozen, her courage suddenly deserting her. What was she doing? These were Hell's Angels. Criminals. Dangerous men. She should turn around and leave. But then the big man turned his head and saw her. His eyes narrowed and he set down his burger. He said something to his friends and they all turned to look. Rosie felt like a rabbit cornered by wolves. The big man stood up and walked over to her. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He had to be at least 250 pounds, all of it muscle and scar tissue, and barely contained violence. "You lost, kid?" he asked. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the voice of a man who didn't have time for games. Rosie shook her head. Her throat was dry. She tried to speak, and nothing came out. The biker frowned. "You're the girl from the other day, the one with the bruise." It wasn't a question. Rosie nodded. The bruise had faded to a greenish yellow now, but it was still visible. The biker crossed his arms over his massive chest. "Where's your mama? She know you're here." "She's at work," Rosie whispered. "You bike here by yourself. That's 4 miles. 5, Rosie corrected quietly. The biker studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed and gestured to an empty booth. "Sit down before you fall down. You want a Coke or something?" Rosie nodded and followed him to the booth. His 2 friends watched from the counter, curious but not interfering. The biker slid into the booth across from her and called out to the waitress, "Betty, get the kid a Coke and some fries." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, brought over the food without comment. Rosie stared at the fries like they were a foreign object. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. The biker pushed the plate toward her. "Eat. Then you're going to tell me why you rode 5 miles on a bike with a bent wheel to find me." Rosie picked up a fry and chewed it slowly. It tasted like cardboard in her dry mouth. The biker waited patient as stone. Finally, Rosie set down the fry and looked up at him. "What's your name?" she asked. The biker raised an eyebrow. "People call me Hawk." "Why Hawk?" "Because I see everything. Now answer my question." Rosie took a breath. "I need you to be my dad, just for one day." Hawk didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react at all for a good 5 seconds. Then he leaned back in the booth, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and studied Rosie with those frost-colored eyes that seemed to see straight through to her bones. "Say that again," he said slowly. "I need you to be my dad," Rosie repeated, her voice stronger now that the words were out. "Just for one day. This Saturday, there's a father-daughter rodeo at my school, and if I show up alone, Caleb Voss is going to beat me up. He promised. And his dad is the sheriff, so nobody's going to stop him." Hawk's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Caleb Voss, Sheriff Raymond Voss's kid. You know him?" "I know of him." Hawk's voice had gone flat, empty of emotion in a way that was somehow more frightening than anger. And you think if I show up with you, this Caleb kid is going to leave you alone? Yes, sir. Because I'm big and scary. Yes, sir. Hawk was silent for a long moment. Then he called over his shoulder, Chisel Gauge, come here. The two men at the counter slid off their stools and walked over. One was lean and wiry, with a shaved head and a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. The other was shorter, but built like a concrete block with a thick black beard and forearms like tree trunks. They both wore the same patches as Hawk, Hell's Angels. Montana. This is Rosie, Hawk said, gesturing to her. Rosie, this is Chisel and Gage. They're my brothers. Rosie looked confused. You don't look related. Gage laughed to sound like rocks in a blender. Different kind of brothers, little bit, the kind that ride together. Rosie here wants me to play daddy for a day. Hawk continued, his tone neutral. Show up at her school, scare off a bully. What do you think? Chisel crouched down next to the booth so he was eye level with Rosie. His eyes were dark brown, sharp, and calculating. Who gave you that bruise, sweetheart? Rosie hesitated. My mom's boyfriend. He got a name, Dale Thornton. Chisel and Gage exchanged a look. Gage whistled low. Deputy Thornton, Voss's boy. Not his son, Hawk corrected, his deputy. But, yeah, same crew. He looked back at Rosie. Your mama know you're asking a Hell's Angel to be your fake daddy. No, sir. She know Dale hits you. Yes, sir. She tried to stop him, but he said if she makes trouble, he'll take me away, put me in foster care. Hawk's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How old are you, Rosie? 8. 8. Hawk repeated the word like it tasted bad. He looked up at his brothers. She's 8 years old and she rode 5 miles on a broken bike to ask a complete stranger for help because every adult in her life has failed her. I have $14, Rosie said suddenly, digging in her pocket. She pulled out a crumpled wad of ones and placed them on the table. I can pay you. Hawk stared at the money like it was a live grenade. Then he looked at Chisel, who had gone very still, and Gage, whose face had darkened with anger. When Hawk spoke again, his voice was quiet, controlled, dangerous, like, put your money away, Rosie, I don't want it. But I have to pay you. That's how it works, right? You do something for someone, they pay you. Not this time. Hawk pulled out his own wallet, extracted a 20, and handed it to the waitress who had been hovering nearby. Betty, call Rosie's mama. Number's probably in the school directory under Miller. Tell her we got her kid and she's safe and she can pick her up here. Betty nodded and headed to the phone behind the counter. Rosie felt panic rising in her chest. Please don't call my mom. She'll be so mad. Please, I just need help. Just one day. That's all I'm asking. Hawk leaned forward, his massive frame making the booth seem tiny. Listen to me very carefully, Rosie Miller. I'm not going to be your fake daddy for a day. You know why? Rosie shook her head, tears starting to well up. Because fake daddies leave when things get hard. And from what you've told me, things are already hard and about to get a whole lot harder. Hawk paused. Sheriff Raymond Voss is a corrupt son of a bitch who's been trying to seize my club's property for the last 8 months. He wants to turn our land into a private prison and make himself rich off the deal. His deputy, this Dale Thornton piece of shit, is part of that same machine. You came to me thinking I'd help you with the school bully problem. Hawk's eyes were cold as Montana winter now. What you actually did, little girl, is hand me a sledgehammer I can use to break that machine apart. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to show up at your school on Saturday. I'm going to bring my brothers, all 31 of them, and we're going to make damn sure nobody lays a hand on you ever again. But this ain't charity and it ain't pretend. You understand? Rosie didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. Good. Now drink your Coke while we wait for your mama. Grace Miller arrived 20 minutes later, driving like a woman possessed, her face white with terror. She burst through the diner door and saw Rosie sitting in a booth with 3 massive bikers in Hell's Angels cuts, and for a moment she looked like she might faint. Hawk stood up and held out his hands in a calming gesture. Mrs. Miller, I'm August Brennan. Your daughter's safe. Nobody touched her. She rode out here on her own. Grace rushed past him and grabbed Rosie, checking her over frantically. Are you hurt? What were you thinking? Do you have any idea how worried I was? I'm sorry, Mama, Rosie whispered. I just needed help. Grace looked up at Hawk, her eyes suspicious and afraid. Help with what? What did she tell you? Hawk gestured to Rosie's faded bruise. She told me about Dale Thornton. She told me about Sheriff Voss's kid. And she asked me to come to the father-daughter rodeo on Saturday to keep her safe. He paused. I said yes. Grace stood up, putting herself between Hawk and Rosie. Absolutely not. I don't know who you think you are, but you're not coming anywhere near my daughter or her school. We don't need your help. Yes, you do, Hawk said quietly. Dale Thornton gave your daughter that bruise. He put his hands on her, and you're so scared of him that you haven't reported it to anyone. Am I wrong? Grace's face crumpled. You don't understand. Dale has connections. If I go to the police, he'll destroy us. He'll take Rosie away from me. He's already destroying you, Chisel said from behind Hawk, and he's going to keep doing it until someone stops him. And you think you can stop him? Grace's voice was shaking. You're bikers, criminals. If you show up at my daughter's school, it'll just make everything worse. Hawk crossed his arms. Mrs. Miller, I'm a veteran, Marine Corps 12 years. I own property in this county, pay my taxes, and vote in every election. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club is a legally registered organization. We have a right to attend public events just like anyone else. Now, your daughter asked me for help and I'm offering it. You can accept or refuse. But either way, Dale Thornton and Raymond Voss are on my radar now, and I don't let things go. Grace looked between Hawk and Rosie, her expression torn. Finally, she sighed. If I say no, are you going to leave us alone? Yes, ma'am. But your daughter rode 5 miles on a broken bike to find me. That tells me she's desperate. And desperate kids do desperate things. Better she has help than tries to handle this alone. Grace closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were filled with tears. Saturday, the father-daughter rodeo starts at 10 in the morning at Clearwater Elementary. If you're going to do this, you show up sober, you follow the rules, and you don't make things worse. You have my word, Hawk said. Grace took Rosie's hand and led her out of the diner. As they were leaving, Rosie turned back and caught Hawk's eye. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," and Hawk nodded once, a sharp movement like a salute. After they left, Gage sat down in the booth and whistled. Brother, we just agreed to go to an elementary school father-daughter rodeo. Club's going to think we've gone soft. Club's going to do what I tell them, Hawk said, his voice hard. And right now I'm telling them we're going to war with Raymond Voss. That little girl just gave us the perfect excuse. Chisel grinned, showing teeth that had been broken and badly reset. About damn time. I've been waiting for an excuse to knock Voss off his throne. Hawk pulled out his phone and started making calls. By the time the sun set that evening, word had gone out to every patched member of the Montana Hells Angels. Church was called for Friday night, mandatory attendance, and the topic was simple: Operation Rosie. Friday night, the clubhouse was packed. The Montana Hells Angels operated out of a fortified compound 15 miles outside Clearwater, a collection of buildings surrounded by chain link fence topped with razor wire. The main building was a converted warehouse with a massive garage bay, a bar, and a meeting room they called the chapel. 31 men sat around a scarred wooden table, their cuts hanging on the backs of their chairs, their faces serious. Hawk stood at the head of the table. Behind him on the wall was the club banner, the winged death's head skull on a field of red and white. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Brothers, we've been dealing with Sheriff Raymond Voss's bullshit for 8 months now. He's been trying to seize our property through eminent domain, claiming we're a public nuisance. He's got judges in his pocket, council members on his payroll, and a whole network of corrupt bastards helping him steal our land so he can build a private prison and make millions. Heads nodded around the table. Every man in the room knew the score. We've been playing defense, Hawk continued. Lawyers' injunctions fighting him in court. That ends now. Tomorrow we go on offense. He told them about Rosie, about Dale Thornton, about the father-daughter rodeo. As he spoke, the expressions around the table grew darker, harder. These were men who had seen combat done time-survived things that would break normal people. But every single one of them had a code, and that code said you don't put your hands on kids. So tomorrow at 10 in the morning, we're rolling out, Hawk said. All of us. Full cuts, dress boots, best behavior. We're going to that elementary school and we're going to send a message to Raymond Voss and everyone in his circle. The message is simple. You touch that little girl again, you touch anyone we claim as ours, and you'll answer to us. A man near the end of the table, a hulking enforcer named Forge, with knuckles scarred from 100 fights, raised his hand. Hawk, I'm in. We're all in. But what's the play after the rodeo? Voss isn't going to just roll over because we showed up at his kid's school. No, he's not, Hawk agreed, which is why Gavel's going to tell you what he found. A lean man with wire-rimmed glasses stood up. Gavel looked more like a college professor than a biker, but the patch on his cut read Sergeant at Arms, and the scars on his hands told the story of a man who'd done violence when necessary. Before the club, Thomas Gavel had been a forensic accountant for the IRS. He'd also been very good at making evidence disappear when the feds got too close to club business. I've been digging into Voss's finances for 6 months, Gavel said, opening a laptop. And I found the smoking gun. Voss has been taking kickbacks from a development company called Blackstone Solutions. They're the ones who want to build the prison. Over the last 2 years, Voss has received $1.3 million in payments through a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Wire fraud, bribery, corruption of a public official. It's all here. He clicked through several documents on his laptop, projecting them onto the wall. Bank statements, email correspondence, contracts. The paper trail was damning. Problem is, Gavel continued, I obtained this through methods that wouldn't hold up in court. We need to get this information to someone who can use it legally, the FBI preferably, but we need leverage to make sure they actually investigate instead of burying it. Hawk nodded, which is where tomorrow comes in. We go to that school, we make noise, we get Voss's attention. He's going to retaliate. When he does, we'll be ready. And when he makes his move, we document everything, add it to Gavel's evidence, and hand the whole package to the feds. Chisel leaned back in his chair. You're using that little girl as bait. I'm using Voss's pride as bait, Hawk corrected. Rosie's under our protection now. Nothing's going to happen to her. But Voss is going to see us at that school surrounded by his constituents, making him look weak in front of his son. He's going to lose his mind, and when he does, he's going to do something stupid. The room was silent for a moment. Then Forge spoke up. What about the girl's mother? She on board with this? Bas. She's scared, Hawk admitted, but she gave permission. And once Voss is gone, once Dale Thornton's in a cell where he belongs, that family will finally be safe. Another hand went up, this one belonging to a scarred veteran named Axel. Hawk, I got a question. Why do you care this much? I mean, yeah, we all hate Voss, but you're personally invested in this kid. Why? The room went very quiet. Hawk's expression didn't change, but his eyes became distant, focused on something only he could see. 15 years ago, Hawk said slowly, I had a daughter, Evelyn. She was 7 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, smartest kid you ever met. She got diagnosed with leukemia, acute lymphoblastic. Doctor said she had a 70% survival rate if we started treatment immediately. He paused, his jaw working. My wife and I did everything right. Chemo, radiation, experimental treatments. We bankrupted ourselves trying to save her. And for a while, it looked like it was working. Evelyn went into remission. We thought we'd won. The men around the table were utterly still. 6 months later, it came back, aggressive. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do. She had maybe 3 months. She lasted 6 weeks. Hawk's voice was flat, now empty. She died in my arms at St. Vincent's Hospital on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 7 years old, and the last thing she said to me was, don't be sad, Daddy, I'm not scared. He looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes. My wife couldn't handle it. She left me a year later, blamed me for not saving Evelyn. Maybe she was right. I joined the club because I needed brothers, needed purpose, needed something to keep me from eating a bullet. And I swore that if I ever had a chance to protect a kid who needed protecting, I wouldn't fail. Not again. The silence stretched. Finally, Gage spoke, his voice rough. Brother, we're with you, all of us. Tomorrow we ride for Rosie, and we don't stop until she's safe. A chorus of agreement rumbled through the chapel. Fists pounded on the table. The vote was unanimous. At 10 in the morning the next day, 32 Hells Angels would descend on Clearwater Elementary School, and the town would never be the same. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of Montana morning that made you grateful to be alive. Rosie woke up at dawn, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She put on her best dress, a hand-me-down from a church donation bin that Grace had carefully altered to fit. It was pale blue with white flowers, and it made Rosie feel almost pretty despite the fading bruise on her face. Grace made pancakes for breakfast, but neither of them could eat. They sat at the dinette table in silence, the clock on the wall ticking away the minutes. Finally, at 9:30, Grace stood up. We should go, she said quietly. If we're doing this, we should get there early. They drove to the school in the old Honda, the engine coughing and sputtering. The parking lot was already filling up with trucks and SUVs, fathers in their Saturday best leading daughters in sundresses and cowboy boots. The rodeo wasn't an actual rodeo with bulls and broncos. It was a town tradition, a day of games and competitions and father-daughter bonding, three-legged races, pie-eating contests, horseshoe tournaments, the kind of wholesome Americana that looked perfect in photographs and felt like torture if you didn't have a father to share it with. Grace parked at the far end of the lot, and they walked toward the athletic field behind the school. Rosie's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She scanned the crowd for Caleb Voss and spotted him near the refreshment table with his father. Sheriff Voss was exactly what you'd expect. Tall, square-jawed, silver hair, perfectly combed, wearing jeans and a crisp button-down shirt with his sheriff's badge clipped to his belt, even on his day off. Caleb stood next to him, already smirking when he saw Rosie. Looks like trailer trash showed up, Caleb called out loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Where's your daddy, Miller? Oh, right, he's dead. Some of the other kids laughed. Some of the parents frowned but didn't say anything. Sheriff Voss put a hand on his son's shoulder, but he was smiling too, enjoying the show. Grace grabbed Rosie's hand and tried to lead her away, but Caleb stepped in front of them. You gonna cry, Rosie? You gonna run home to your trailer? Leave her alone, Caleb, Grace said, her voice shaking. Or what you gonna call the sheriff? Caleb laughed and pointed at his father. Too late, Sheriff Voss stepped forward, his smile widening. Now, Caleb, be nice. It's not Rosie's fault she doesn't have a proper family. Some people just make bad choices. He looked at Grace with thinly veiled contempt. Isn't that right, Mrs. Miller? Or is it Ms. Miller hard to keep track? Grace's face went red, but she didn't respond. She knew better than to antagonize the sheriff in front of the entire town. Rosie felt tears burning in her eyes, felt the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down on her. This was a mistake. Hawk wasn't coming. He'd probably forgotten or decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She was going to have to endure this alone, just like she endured everything else. And then the ground began to shake. It started as a vibration so low and deep that people felt it in their chests before they heard it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned looking for the source. And then the sound hit a rolling thunder that echoed off the brick walls of the school building. Motorcycles, not one or two, but a fleet, an army. They came around the corner of Maple Street in perfect formation, 2x2 chrome glinting in the morning sun. 32 Harley Davidsons, each one a masterpiece of American engineering, each one piloted by a man in full leather cut, displaying the winged death's head of the Hells Angels. The noise was apocalyptic. It drowned out the country music playing from the PA system. It rattled the windows. It made small children cover their ears, and parents grabbed their kids and pulled them back from the street. At the head of the formation rode Hawk, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, his jaw set, his massive frame making the Road King beneath him look almost small. Behind him rode Chisel Gage, Gavel Forge Axel, and 26 more men whose names Rosie didn't know, but whose presence was undeniable. They didn't just ride past the school. Hawk raised his left hand in a signal, and as one, the entire formation turned into the school parking lot. They rode right past the carefully arranged parking cones, right past the parent volunteers who were too shocked to protest, and they lined up in a perfect row along the edge of the athletic field. 32 kickstands came down in a wave of metallic clicks. 32 engines cut off simultaneously, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. And then 32 men dismounted and began walking toward the field. They moved in formation, boots crunching on gravel, leather creaking, chains rattling. Parents grabbed their children. Teachers stood frozen. Principal Morrison, a nervous man in his 50s, looked like he was having a heart attack. The wall of bikers parted and Hawk walked through. He scanned the crowd, his winter-colored eyes moving over the sea of shocked faces until they landed on Rosie. His expression softened just slightly and he walked straight toward her. Sheriff Voss stepped into his path. That's far enough. This is a private school event. You and your gang need to turn around and leave before I arrest every one of you for trespassing. Hawk stopped about 3 feet from Voss. He was taller than the sheriff by a good 4 inches and outweighed him by 50 pounds of muscle. He took off his sunglasses slowly and met Voss's eyes. This is a public school sheriff, funded by taxpayer money, my taxpayer money, and this is a public event advertised in the town newspaper. We have every right to be here. Not dressed like that, you don't. Those cuts are gang colors. I can arrest you for what? Hawk interrupted, his voice calm and cold. Wearing a vest? Riding a motorcycle? Being a member of a legally registered club? Go ahead, Sheriff. Arrest me. I'm sure the ACLU would love to hear about it. Voss's face was turning red. What the hell do you want, Brennan? Hawk smiled, showing teeth. I'm here for the father-daughter rodeo. Didn't you get the memo? He looked past Voss and called out, Rosie, come here, sweetheart. Every eye in the athletic field turned to Rosie. She stood frozen for a moment, terrified and hopeful, and unable to believe this was actually happening. Grace squeezed her hand and whispered, Go on, baby, it's okay. Rosie walked forward on shaking legs. She passed Caleb, whose smirk had evaporated into open-mouthed shock. She passed Sheriff Voss, who looked like he'd swallowed a live grenade. And she stopped in front of Hawk, who knelt down on one knee in the grass, bringing himself to her eye level. Hey, Rosie, he said gently, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Hit some traffic on the highway. You ready for this thing? Rosie's eyes were swimming with tears, but she was smiling so hard her face hurt. You came. You really came. Told you I would. Hawk held out his hand and Rosie took it. His palm was rough and scarred and completely engulfed her small hand. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly, and set her on his shoulders. From her perch on Hawk's shoulders, Rosie could see the entire field. She could see the shocked faces of parents, the wide eyes of children, the 31 Hells Angels standing in formation like an honor guard. And she could see Caleb Voss, his face pale, backing slowly toward his father. Sheriff Voss was staring at Hawk with pure hatred. You think this is funny, Brennan? You think rolling up here with your gang is going to intimidate me? I think, Hawk said calmly, still holding Rosie steady on his shoulders, that I'm here to spend time with my daughter, just like all these other fathers. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe there's a 3-legged race starting soon. He turned and walked toward the registration table where a terrified PTA volunteer was holding a clipboard. The other angels followed, spreading out across the field. Some parents pulled their children away. Others, surprisingly, stood their ground, curiosity overcoming fear. A few even nodded respectfully at the bikers, recognizing fellow veterans from the military tattoos and old unit patches sewn onto cuts. Principal Morrison finally found his voice and hurried over to Hawk. Mr. Brennan, I must protest. This is highly irregular. These men can't just what Gavel stepped forward, his lawyer voice smooth and precise. Attend a public event at a taxpayer-funded school. I've reviewed Montana State Education Code, Principal Morrison. There's no regulation prohibiting community members from participating in school functions unless you're discriminating based on appearance or association, which would be a violation of civil rights law. Morrison opened and closed his mouth like a fish. He looked at Sheriff Voss for backup, but Voss was already on his phone, undoubtedly calling for reinforcements. Morrison cleared his throat. Fine, but any trouble at all, and I'm shutting this whole thing down. Understood, Hawk said. He looked down at the PTA volunteer. Ma'am, we'd like to register for the events. I believe there's a three-legged race horseshoe tournament and a pie-eating contest. The woman whose name tag read Barbara stared at him. Then to everyone's surprise, she smiled. Of course, names please. August Brennan and Rose Miller. Barbara wrote it down, her hand shaking slightly. You'll be in Heat 3 for the three-legged race. Starts in 15 minutes. Hawk lifted Rosie down from his shoulders and knelt beside her. He pulled a length of rope from his vest pocket, the kind used to tie down cargo on a motorcycle. All right, kiddo, you ever done a three-legged race before? Rosie shook her head. Simple. I tie my left leg to your right leg and we run together. The trick is to move in sync. You set the pace. I'll match you. Ready? He tied the rope securely, but not too tight, then stood up. They practiced a few steps, Rosie giggling as they stumbled and found their rhythm. Around them, other fathers and daughters were doing the same, though most were watching the bikers warily. Caleb Voss and his father were in Heat 3 as well. Sheriff Voss's face was stone as he tied his leg to Caleb's. When he caught Hawk's eye, there was a promise of violence there, of retribution. Hawk met his gaze without flinching. The whistle blew. 6 father-daughter teams lined up at the starting line. Hawk and Rosie were on the far left. Voss and Caleb were in the center. The gym teacher, Mr. Patterson, raised a starting pistol. On your marks, get set, go. The pistol cracked. Chaos erupted. Most teams immediately stumbled and fell, fathers barking instructions while daughters laughed. Hawk and Rosie moved like they'd been practicing for weeks. Hawk's long strides matched Rosie's shorter ones perfectly, and they surged ahead. Voss and Caleb were fast, too, Voss practically dragging his son along, his competitive nature overriding his anger. It was close. Hawk and Rosie crossed the finish line half a step ahead of Voss and Caleb. The angels on the sidelines erupted in cheers, whistling and clapping. Rosie was breathless and laughing, her face flushed with joy. Hawk untied the rope and lifted her up, spinning her around. We won! Rosie shrieked. Damn right we did, Hawk grinned. Sheriff Voss stood at the finish line, breathing hard, his face red with exertion and humiliation. Caleb looked like he might cry. They'd lost to a biker and a trailer park kid in front of the entire town. For a man like Raymond Voss, whose entire identity was built on dominance and control, it was unacceptable. The next event was horseshoes. Hawk paired up with Rosie again, teaching her the proper grip and throwing stance. She was terrible at it, her tosses landing nowhere near the stake, but Hawk was patient and encouraging. When she finally landed one within a foot of the target, he high-fived her so hard she almost fell over. Forge, the massive enforcer, paired up with a shy 9-year-old named Emma, whose father was deployed overseas. Emma's mother had brought her to the rodeo, and when Forge had quietly asked if Emma needed a partner, the mother had cried and said yes. Now Forge was teaching Emma to throw horseshoes with the same gentle patience Hawk showed Rosie. Around the field, other angels were integrating themselves into the event. Chisel was running the relay race with a girl named Sophie. Gage was helping 3 kids fix a broken sawhorse for the woodworking station. Axel, who had lost his right leg below the knee in Iraq and wore a prosthetic, was teaching a group of fascinated children about motorcycle mechanics. The atmosphere was shifting, the initial fear and shock were fading, replaced by curiosity and in some cases acceptance. These weren't monsters, they were men rough around the edges and covered in tattoos, but men who clearly cared about kids, veterans who understood duty and service, fathers and uncles and brothers who had come here for one little girl and ended up touching dozens. But not everyone was won over. Sheriff Voss watched it all with barely contained rage. He pulled Caleb aside and spoke to him in a low, harsh voice. Caleb nodded, his expression hardening. Then Voss made another phone call, and 5 minutes later, three sheriff's cruisers pulled into the parking lot. Dale Thornton stepped out of one of the cruisers. He was in uniform, his badge gleaming, his hand resting on his service weapon. He scanned the field until he spotted Grace, who had been sitting on a blanket with a group of other mothers nervously watching Rosie. When Grace saw Dale, the color drained from her face. Dale walked straight toward her, ignoring the angels, ignoring the parents, his focus entirely on Grace. She stood up instinctively, putting distance between herself and him. Dale grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. "You brought those bikers here," Dale hissed. "You told them about us. You made me look like a fool." "Dale, let go. You're hurting me. I'll do a lot worse than hurt you if you don't fix this. Call them off. Tell them to leave." Gage saw it happen. He was 30 feet away, but he covered the distance in seconds, moving with a speed that belied his stocky build. He grabbed Dale's wrist and twisted, forcing him to release Grace. Dale spun around, his other hand going for his gun, but Gage was faster. He had Dale's gun hand pinned before the weapon cleared the holster. "I wouldn't," Gage said quietly, "not unless you want to explain to your captain why you drew on an unarmed civilian at a school event." Other deputies were running over now, hands on their weapons. The angels on the field went still, their postures shifting from relaxed to ready. Parents grabbed their children. The festive atmosphere evaporated in an instant, replaced by the crackling tension of imminent violence. Hawk was at Gage's side, in moments Rosie clinging to his hand. "Let him go, brother," Hawk said calmly. "It's not worth it." Gage released Dale, who stumbled back, his face purple with rage. "You just assaulted a police officer," Dale snarled. "I can arrest every one of you right now." "For what?" Gavel appeared, his phone already recording. "Preventing you from assaulting a civilian. I have video of you grabbing Ms. Miller without provocation. You drew your weapon in the presence of children. I'd be very careful about what claims you make, Deputy Thornton." Sheriff Voss arrived, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on here?" "Your deputy assaulted my mother," Rosie said suddenly, her voice small but clear in the tense silence. He grabbed her. That man stopped him. She pointed at Gage. Every parent near shot had seen it. Several were already whispering. Barbara, the PTA volunteer, was filming on her phone. Voss looked at Dale, then at the crowd, and made a calculation. He couldn't arrest the bikers without witnesses confirming that his deputy was the aggressor, and he couldn't afford a scandal, not when he was already walking a tightrope with the land seizure. "Dale, get back to your cruiser," Voss said tersely. "We'll discuss this later." Dale looked like he wanted to argue, but Voss's glare silenced him. He stalked back to his cruiser, shooting venomous looks at Grace and the angels. The other deputies followed, and the tension broke. "This event is over," Principal Morrison announced shakily. "Everyone please pack up and leave in an orderly fashion." Parents began gathering their things, the cheerful rodeo ending on a sour note. But many stopped to talk to the angels, to shake hands and thank them. A veteran in a Marine's cap clasped Hawk's hand and said, "Semper Fi, brother. Thank you for standing up." A mother whose daughter had played with Rosie thanked Gage for protecting Grace. Sheriff Voss stood near the parking lot watching it all with dead eyes. His son Caleb stood beside him, and for the first time Rosie saw fear on the bully's face. Caleb wasn't afraid of her anymore. He was afraid of what his father would do. As the crowd dispersed, Hawk walked Grace and Rosie to the old Honda. Grace was shaking, adrenaline and fear making her hands tremble. "Thank you," she whispered, "for protecting us, for giving Rosie this day." "It's not over," Hawk said quietly. "Voss is going to retaliate. Dale's going to come looking for payback. You can't go back to that trailer park. It's not safe." "We don't have anywhere else to go." Hawk pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Our clubhouse, 15 miles north on Highway 87, big steel gate with a death's head. You come there tonight with Rosie, and whatever you can pack, we've got room. You'll be safe." Grace stared at the card. I can't just move in with a biker gang. It's not forever, just until we deal with Voss and Dale." Hawk's expression softened. "Ms. Miller, your daughter rode 5 miles on a broken bike to ask a stranger for help because she had no one else. Don't make her regret trusting me." Grace looked at Rosie, who was watching with wide, hopeful eyes. Finally, Grace nodded. "Okay, tonight, but just until it's safe." "Good enough." That night, Grace packed everything of value they owned into 2 duffel bags and 3 trash bags. It wasn't much. Clothes, photos, a few books, Rosie's stuffed rabbit. They left the trailer park after dark, the Honda's headlights cutting through the Montana night. Grace followed Hawk's directions, and 20 minutes later they pulled up to a massive steel gate set in a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A camera swiveled to look at them, and then the gate rolled open with a mechanical groan. The clubhouse compound was bigger than Grace had expected. There was a main building that looked like a converted warehouse, a separate garage bay with a dozen motorcycles in various states of repair, and two smaller structures that might have been bunkhouses. Warm light spilled from the windows, and she could hear music and voices. Hawk was waiting for them in the parking area. He helped carry their bags inside, leading them through a bar area where several angels were playing pool and drinking beer, past a kitchen that smelled of grilled meat, and down a hallway to a small but clean room with two beds, a dresser, and a window. "It's not much," Hawk said, "but it's secure. Bathrooms down the hall, kitchen's always open. You're safe here." Rosie immediately claimed the bed near the window and sat down, bouncing slightly. She looked happier than Grace had seen her in months. Grace felt tears building again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Hawk. "What do you get out of helping us?" Hawk was quiet for a moment. "I get to keep a promise I made to myself a long time ago. That's enough." He left them to settle in. Rosie fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. Grace sat on her own bed, staring at the wall, trying to process everything for the first time in 3 years since Barrett had died. Since Dale had entered their lives, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. But while Grace and Rosie slept safely at the clubhouse, Sheriff Raymond Voss was making plans of his own. He sat in his home office, a scotch in one hand, his phone in the other. He'd spent the last 3 hours making calls to the county prosecutor, to the state police, to his partners at Blackstone Solutions, the development company that wanted to build a private prison on the Angels' land. "I want those bikers gone," he said into the phone. "I don't care how you do it. Raid the clubhouse, arrest them on drug charges, weapons violations. I don't care. I want them off my land and out of my town by the end of the week." The voice on the other end was cautious. "Raymond, we need to be smart about this. The optics of what happened today aren't great. You've got a deputy who assaulted a woman in front of witnesses, and you've got bikers who came across as the good guys. We push too hard, it's going to blow back on us." "I don't care about optics," Voss snarled. "Those bastards humiliated me in front of the entire town, in front of my son. They need to learn that you don't cross me, not in my county." "What about the land seizure? If we move against them now, it's going to look retaliatory. The judge might throw out the eminent domain case." Voss thought about that. The land was worth millions. The private prison deal would set him up for life. But his pride, his need to dominate, was screaming for immediate action. "Fine, we go subtle. I want eyes on that clubhouse 24/7. I want to know everyone who comes and goes, and I want dirt, something we can use to justify a raid. In the meantime, I'm putting pressure on their support network. Anyone who does business with them, I'm going to make their lives hell." He hung up and made another call, this one to Dale Thornton. "Dale, that woman, Grace Miller, she's harboring at the clubhouse now. I want you to file for an emergency custody hearing. Claim she's an unfit mother exposing her child to a criminal environment. Get a judge to sign off on removal of the kid." "Boss, are you sure after what happened today?" "Do it," Voss snapped. "And while you're at it, find out everything you can about August Brennan. Criminal history, financial records, everyone he's ever cared about. I want leverage." Dale hesitated, then said, "There might be something. I heard through the grapevine that Brennan had a daughter once, died of cancer or something. Might be able to use that." Voss smiled cold and cruel. "Find out everything. If Brennan wants to play daddy to that trailer park brat, let's remind him what happens when you care about someone." While Voss plotted in his office, another player was making moves. His name was Wade Morrison, road name Cutter, and he was a member of the Montana Hells Angels. He'd been patched in 3 years ago, had done time for the club, had bled with his brothers, but Wade had a secret. For the last 6 months, he'd been feeding information to Sheriff Voss in exchange for having his parole violations overlooked and the promise of witness protection if things ever went south. Wade sat in his truck outside a gas station talking on a burner phone. "Yeah, it's me," he said quietly. "They brought the woman and kid to the clubhouse. Hawk's getting personally involved. I think he sees the kid as some kind of second chance." "Good," Voss's voice came through the phone. "Keep me updated on their movements. I want to know if they're planning anything. And Wade, if you get a chance to sabotage them from the inside, take it. Create division. Make them doubt each other. I want that club fractured before we move." "Understood." Wade hung up and stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like hell. Haunted eyes, lines of stress carved deep in his face. He'd been a good angel once, had believed in the Brotherhood, but the weight of what he'd done, the betrayals he'd committed, was crushing him. He told himself it was survival, that he was doing what he had to do. But late at night, when the clubhouse was quiet and his brothers were sleeping, Wade hated himself. He started the truck and drove back to the clubhouse where Hawk and the others were planning their next move. Wade would sit at that table, would nod and agree, and offer suggestions, all while feeding everything back to the man who wanted to destroy them. Back at the clubhouse, Hawk sat in the chapel with his core leadership. Gavel had his laptop open, displaying the evidence he'd compiled on Voss. Chisel Gauge Forge and Axel sat around the table along with half a dozen other senior members. Wade Morrison sat near the end, taking notes. All right, Hawk said. We knew showing up today would provoke a response. Voss isn't going to take the humiliation lying down, so we need to be ready. Gavel, where are we with the evidence? Gavel tapped his keyboard. Solid on the financial crimes. I've got bank statements, wire transfers, email correspondence between Voss and Blackstone Solutions. It's a clear pattern of bribery and corruption. The problem is chain of custody. I obtained most of this through, let's call them, extra legal means. It wouldn't be admissible in court. So we need to get it to someone who can investigate legally, Hawk said. FBI. That's the play, but we need more than just financial records. We need something that gives them jurisdiction, interstate commerce wire fraud across state lines, something that makes it a federal case. Forge leaned forward. What about the private prison angle? Blackstone Solutions is a national company. If Voss is taking bribes to facilitate interstate business, that's federal. It is, Gavel agreed. But we need proof of the quid pro quo. We need Voss on record explicitly connecting the bribes to the land seizure. So we get him to talk, Chisel said. Set up a meeting, wear a wire, get him to confess. Who's he going to meet with? Gage asked. He's not stupid enough to meet with any of us. Wade spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. What about the woman, Grace Miller? She's a civilian. If she reached out to Voss, claimed she wanted to testify against us in exchange for protection, he might take the meeting. Every eye turned to Wade. Hawk studied him for a long moment. You want to put Grace in a room with Voss, the man whose deputy beat her. I'm just saying it's an option, Wade said with a shrug. She's got credibility, single mother scared for her kid. Voss would believe she flipped. Absolutely not, Hawk said flatly. We're not using Grace as bait. Next idea. The meeting continued for another hour, plans being proposed and discarded. By the end, they'd settled on a two-pronged approach. First, increase security around the clubhouse and maintain constant surveillance on Voss and his people. Second, Gavel would reach out to a contact he had in the FBI field office, someone he'd worked with years ago who might be willing to look at the evidence off the record. After the meeting broke up, Wade slipped outside and made a quick call to Voss, relaying everything he'd heard. Voss listened, then said, "They're going to the feds. We need to move faster. I want that clubhouse raided by the end of the week." They've got the woman and kid there, Wade warned. You raid now, it's going to look bad. Then we make sure Child Protective Services shows up first, remove the kid for her own safety, then go in. Nobody can say we put a child at risk. Wade felt his stomach churn. Boss, the kid's just a little girl. She's been through enough. She should have stayed out of it, Voss said coldly. But this is war, Wade. There are casualties. You having second thoughts? No, Wade said quickly. No second thoughts. I'll keep you posted. He hung up and leaned against his truck, feeling sick. He'd joined the Angels because he'd needed brothers, but his criminal record had made him vulnerable, and Voss had exploited that vulnerability. Now he was in too deep complicit in things that would get him killed if the club found out, but if he stopped cooperating with Voss, he'd go back to prison. There was no good way out. Inside the clubhouse, Rosie couldn't sleep. She crept out of the room she shared with Grace and wandered down the hallway, drawn by voices and light. She found Hawk sitting alone in the chapel, the big meeting room empty now, nursing a beer and staring at nothing. "Hey, sweetheart," he said when he saw her. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep," Rosie said. She climbed up onto a chair across from him. "Are you mad at me?" Hawk frowned. "Why would I be mad at you?" "Because of today, because Sheriff Voss is mad and Dale is mad and now you have problems because of me." Hawk set down his beer and leaned forward. "Rosie, listen to me very carefully. None of this is your fault, not one bit. You asked for help because you needed it. That's brave, not bad. And the problems we have with Voss and Dale existed long before you came into the picture. This was going to happen eventually. You just gave us a reason worth fighting for. But what if you get hurt? What if something bad happens because of me?" Hawk reached across the table and took her small hand in his massive one. "Then it happens, but it won't be your fault. It'll be the fault of bad men doing bad things. You understand?" Rosie nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Can I ask you something on anything? Why did you really help me? Was it just because of Sheriff Voss?" Hawk was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph. He slid it across the table. It showed a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, blonde hair and pigtails, blue eyes, bright with joy. She was sitting on a motorcycle, Hawk beside her, both of them grinning. "Her name was Evelyn," Hawk said softly. "She was my daughter. She died 15 years ago. Cancer." Rosie looked at the photo, then at Hawk. "I'm sorry." "Me too." Hawk took the photo back and stared at it. After she died, I thought I'd never care about anything again. I thought the best parts of me died with her. But then you showed up 8 years old and braver than most grown men I know, asking for help. And I realized maybe I still had something to give. Maybe I could still protect someone who needed protecting. Do I remind you of her? No, Hawk said honestly. You're nothing like Evelyn. She was quiet, bookish, hated motorcycles. You're fierce and stubborn, and you rode 5 miles on a broken bike to find me. But you both have something in common. You both deserved better than the world gave you. And I failed Evelyn. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you. Rosie stood up and walked around the table. She climbed onto Hawk's lap and hugged him, her small arms barely reaching around his massive chest. Hawk went very still, then carefully wrapped his arms around her and held her close. You're a good dad, Rosie whispered. Even if you're not really my dad. Hawk's eyes burned and he blinked hard. Yeah, kiddo, even if I'm not. They sat like that for a long time, a broken man and a scared little girl, finding comfort in each other's presence. Neither of them knew that in 3 days, everything would fall apart, that Sheriff Voss would make his move, that Cutter's betrayal would be revealed in the worst possible way, that blood would be spilled and lives would hang in the balance. But for now, in this moment, they had peace, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made your bones ache. Grace woke early in the small room at the clubhouse, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Rosie was still asleep, curled around her stuffed rabbit, her face peaceful in a way Grace hadn't seen in months. For the first time since Barrett died, Grace felt something close to hope. That hope lasted exactly 43 minutes. At 7:15 in the morning, 3 vehicles pulled up to the clubhouse gate, 2 sheriff's cruisers, and a white sedan with government plates. Hawk was in the garage working on a carburetor when the perimeter alarm sounded. He walked to the gate, wiping grease from his hands, and found himself facing Sheriff Raymond Voss, Deputy Dale Thornton, and a thin woman in a gray pantsuit carrying a briefcase. Morning, Brennan, Voss said with a cold smile. This is Sandra Hutchins from Child Protective Services. We're here to remove Rose Miller from the premises. Hawk's expression didn't change, but his hands stilled. On what grounds? The woman Hutchins stepped forward. She was in her 50s with tired eyes and the bureaucratic manner of someone who'd seen too much and stopped caring. We received a report that a minor child is being housed in an environment associated with criminal activity. Montana state law requires us to investigate and, if necessary, remove the child to protective custody pending a hearing. Who filed the report? Hawk asked, though he already knew. That's confidential, Hutchins said. Mr. Brennan and I can do this with your cooperation or with a court order and law enforcement assistance. But either way, I'm taking the child. Behind Hawk, other angels were emerging from the clubhouse, gauge, chisel, forge, gavel. They spread out behind their president, a wall of leather and muscle. Voss's hand drifted toward his service weapon. The deputies behind him tensed. Stand down, brothers, Hawk said quietly without turning around. Let them in. He unlocked the gate and led them to the clubhouse. Grace was in the kitchen making coffee when she saw the entourage walk in. Her face went white. Dale smiled at her, vicious and triumphant. Rosie appeared in the hallway, saw the sheriff and his deputy, and ran to Grace, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. Hutchins pulled papers from her briefcase. Ms. Miller, I have an emergency custody order. Rose Miller is to be removed from this location and placed in temporary foster care pending a fitness hearing scheduled for Friday morning. No, Grace said, her voice shaking. You can't. She's my daughter. You brought your daughter to live in a motorcycle club compound, Hutchins said flatly. That demonstrates poor judgment and puts the child at risk. The court agrees. Deputies, please take the child. Dale stepped forward, reaching for Rosie. Grace pulled her daughter behind her. Don't you dare touch her. You're the one who gave her that bruise. You're the one who beats us. Allegations without evidence, Dale said smoothly. All anyone knows for sure is you're shacking up with a biker gang and exposing your kid to criminals. Rosie was crying now, clinging to Grace. Hawk stepped between Dale and the Millers. Deputy, you take one more step and you'll regret it. Voss pulled his weapon. That's a threat against a law enforcement officer. Step back, Brennan, or I will put you down. The other angels moved forward. Weapons appeared. The situation was seconds from turning into a bloodbath. And then Gavel spoke up, his lawyer voice cutting through the tension. Everyone stop right now. He looked at Hutchins. Ms. Hutchins, I'm an attorney. I'd like to see that custody order. Hutchins handed it over. Gavel read it quickly, his expression darkening. This order was signed by Judge Marcus Holloway, who coincidentally plays golf every weekend with Sheriff Voss. It claims the child is in immediate danger, but provides no specific evidence. This is a retaliatory action, and it won't hold up in a real hearing. Maybe not, Hutchins said, but it holds up right now, and right now I'm taking the child. Hawk looked at Grace. Her face was streaked with tears, her arms wrapped protectively around Rosie. He saw the same desperation he'd seen in her daughter's eyes at Red's roadside, the same helplessness, and he made a decision. Grace, he said quietly, let her go. Grace stared at him in disbelief. What? Let her go? They have a court order. If we fight this, someone gets hurt, someone gets arrested, and then Rosie's in the system anyway, and we're in jail and can't help her. Hawk knelt down in front of Rosie. Listen to me, sweetheart. You're going to go with this lady for a few days, just a few days. We're going to fight this in court, and we're going to win, and you're going to come home. But right now, you need to be brave. Can you do that? Rosie's lip was trembling, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to go. Please don't make me go. I know, kiddo, but this is temporary. I promise you I will get you back. Do you trust me? Rosie nodded, sobbing. Hawk stood and looked at Hutchins. Where are you taking her? Foster placement in Billings. She'll be safe and well cared for. If she has so much as a scratch when I see her again, I will burn your entire department to the ground. Hawk said, his voice so cold it made Hutchins take a step back. Do you understand me? Hutchins nodded stiffly. The child will be safe. You have my word. Grace kissed Rosie's forehead, whispered something in her ear, then let her go. Rosie walked to Hutchins on shaking legs, clutching her stuffed rabbit. As they let her out, she looked back at Hawk one more time. He raised his hand in a small wave, his face carved from stone. The moment they were gone, Grace collapsed. Hawk caught her before she hit the floor, holding her while she sobbed. Voss watched with satisfaction, then tipped his hat mockingly at Hawk. Have a good day, Brennan. See you in court. After they left, the clubhouse erupted. Angels were shouting demanding action, ready to ride into town and tear the sheriff's department apart. Hawk let them vent for 5 minutes, then slammed his fist on the chapel table hard enough to crack the wood. Enough, his voice cut through the chaos. Everyone sit down, now. They sat. Hawk paced at the head of the table, his face dark with rage, carefully controlled. Voss just played us perfectly. He took the kid, made us look like the bad guys, and did it all legally. We can't fight this with fists. We fight it with lawyers and evidence. The hearing is Friday, Gavel said. That's 4 days. I can file motions challenge the order, but I'll need evidence that Grace is a fit mother and that this was retaliatory. What about your FBI contact? Chisel asked. Can we get them to move faster? I reached out. She's interested but cautious. Without hard evidence linking Voss directly to a federal crime, she can't justify opening an investigation. Forge slammed his hand on the table. So we're just supposed to sit here while that little girl suffers while Voss wins? No, Hawk said. We get the evidence Gavel needs. Voss has been sloppy, he's angry, he's arrogant, and he's going to make a mistake. We push him, we make him react, and when he does, we document everything. Over the next 3 days, the Montana Hells Angels launched a campaign of perfectly legal but utterly infuriating resistance. Gavel filed a dozen motions challenging the custody order, each one requiring Voss's lawyers to respond. Chisel organized a protest outside the courthouse, 50 bikers standing silently with signs reading, "Protect children, not corrupt sheriffs." Axel gave an interview to the local newspaper detailing the events at the father-daughter rodeo, painting the Angels as community-minded veterans protecting a vulnerable family. The public response was mixed but trending in the Angels' favor. Voss's approval ratings dropped. The county commissioner started asking questions about the land seizure. Blackstone Solutions, nervous about the negative publicity, began distancing themselves from the sheriff, and Voss, as Hawk predicted, started making mistakes. On Wednesday night, Voss met with his contact at Blackstone Solutions at a bar outside of town. Gavel had anticipated this and had Gage follow Voss. Gage sat in a booth nearby with a recording device hidden in his jacket, capturing every word. You need to get this under control, Raymond, the Blackstone executive said. Our investors are nervous. The optics of you seizing land from veterans while taking a little girl away from her mother, it's a disaster for us. I have it under control, Voss snapped. The hearing is Friday. I'll get the judge to declare the mother unfit, put the kid in permanent foster care. The bikers will lose their leverage. And the land seizure moves forward next week. I've got the votes on the council. The eminent domain order will be approved, and your people can start construction by the end of the month. You'll get your prison, and I'll get my consulting fee. $2 million is agreed. That's a bribe, Raymond. You're talking about a bribe in a public place. It's not a bribe, it's a consulting fee for services rendered. Perfectly legal. Gage had it all on tape. He slipped out of the bar and drove straight back to the clubhouse. Gavel listened to the recording 3 times, his smile growing wider each time. This is it, Gavel said. This is federal, interstate bribery conspiracy to commit fraud. I can take this to the FBI and they'll have to investigate. Do it, Hawk said. But we need insurance. Voss is going to know we're coming for him. He's going to try to destroy evidence, maybe even run. We need to make sure he can't. How, Chisel asked. Hawk thought for a moment. We make him think he's won. We let him believe we've given up, and then we hit him when he's not looking. Thursday morning, Hawk did something that shocked everyone. He called Sheriff Voss directly and asked for a meeting. Voss, suspicious but intrigued, agreed. They met at a diner in neutral territory, just the two of them, in a booth in the back. "What do you want, Brennan?" Voss asked. "To make a deal," Hawk said. He looked defeated, worn down. "You win, Sheriff. We're pulling out. The club's going to sell the land and relocate to Wyoming. The custody hearing tomorrow, we won't contest it. Grace will comply with whatever the court decides. We're done fighting." Voss studied him, looking for the trap. "Just like that, you're giving up. That little girl's been in foster care for 4 days. She's 8 years old, and she's terrified. I'm not going to keep dragging this out just to prove a point. You wanted us gone. Fine, we're gone. I just want your word that once we leave, you'll leave Grace and Rosie alone. Let them rebuild their lives." Voss leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You actually care about them. I thought it was just a game, but you actually care. Do we have a deal or not?" "We have a deal," Voss said. "You leave quietly. I'll make sure the girl goes to a good foster home. Might even convince the judge to let the mother have supervised visits." They shook hands. Hawk left the diner, and Voss immediately pulled out his phone and called Dale Thornton. "It worked," Voss said. Brennan folded. "They're pulling out. I want you to move up the timeline on the land seizure, get the bulldozers lined up for Monday morning. I want that clubhouse leveled before they change their minds. What about the kid? What about her? She's in the system now, foster care, maybe adoption eventually. Either way, not our problem." Dale hesitated. "Boss, I know the mother. Grace is a good person. The kid, too. Maybe we could... Could what grow a conscience, Dale? We're so close to being rich men. Don't go soft on me now." Dale swallowed his objections. "Understood, boss." But Dale Thornton was many things: a bully, a corrupt cop, an abuser, but he wasn't stupid. Something about Hawk's surrender felt wrong. The man he'd seen at the father-daughter rodeo, the man who'd stared him down without flinching, didn't seem like someone who gave up easily. Dale made a decision. He was going to cover his own ass. That night, Dale broke into the evidence locker at the sheriff's department and started copying files, emails between Voss and Blackstone Solutions, financial records, anything that could implicate Voss in corruption. Dale had been complicit in a lot of it, but if things went south, he wanted leverage. He burned everything to a flash drive, hid it in his truck, and went home. He didn't notice Wade Morrison watching from across the street. Wade had been following Dale on Voss's orders, making sure the deputy didn't get cold feet. When he saw Dale breaking into the evidence locker, Wade knew exactly what was happening. Dale was building an insurance policy, which meant Dale thought Voss might go down, which meant the whole house of cards was about to collapse. Wade sat in his truck, his hands shaking. He'd been feeding information to Voss for months, betraying his brothers, all to avoid going back to prison. But now the endgame was here, and Wade realized he was going to end up either dead or in witness protection, cut off from everything he'd ever known. He pulled out his burner phone and called Voss. "We've got a problem. Dale just copied files from the evidence locker. I think he's building an exit strategy." Voss was silent for a long moment. "Where is he now?" "Driving home." "Follow him. Make sure he doesn't run. I'll handle this." Wade followed Dale's truck through the dark Montana streets, his stomach churning. He knew what handle this meant. Voss was going to kill Dale or disappear him. And if Voss could do that to his own deputy, what would he do to a biker informant who knew everything? Wade made a decision. He pulled over, let Dale's truck disappear into the distance, and drove to the clubhouse. It was nearly midnight when he pulled up to the gate. The cameras tracked him as he approached, and Chisel's voice came through the intercom. "Cutter, what are you doing here? Thought you were visiting your sister in Missoula. I need to talk to Hawk. It's urgent." "It's midnight, brother." "I know, it's important." Chisel let him in. Wade walked into the clubhouse with his heart hammering. Hawk was still awake, sitting in the chapel with gavel going over legal documents for tomorrow's hearing. He looked up when Wade entered. "Cutter, what's going on?" Wade stood there, every instinct screaming at him to run, to lie, to keep his betrayal hidden. But he thought about Rosie, that little girl who'd been brave enough to ask for help. And he thought about his brothers who'd trusted him. And he made the hardest choice of his life. "I've been working for Voss," Wade said. His voice was steady despite the terror coursing through him. "For 6 months. He had leverage on me, parole violations he said he'd overlook if I fed him information about the club. I told him everything about the Rosie situation, about Gavel's evidence, about your meeting with the FBI contact, everything." The room went dead silent. Hawk stood up slowly, his face unreadable. Gavel closed his laptop. Chisel appeared in the doorway, having heard everything. "Keep talking," Hawk said quietly. Tonight, Dale Thornton copied files from the sheriff's evidence locker. Voss told me to follow him and make sure he didn't run. I think Voss is planning to kill Dale or make him disappear, and I think once Dale's gone, I'm next. So I'm here to tell you everything I know, every meeting Voss had, every plan he made, all of it. Wade pulled a notebook from his jacket and set it on the table. I wrote it all down, dates, times, conversations, it's all there. Hawk picked up the notebook and flipped through it, page after page of Wade's handwriting, documenting months of corruption, conspiracy, and criminal activity. It was a goldmine of evidence. It was also a complete betrayal of Brotherhood. Why now? Hawk asked. Why tell us now instead of running? Because I'm tired of being scared, Wade said, and because that little girl trusted you when nobody else would. I figure the least I can do is give you what you need to save her. Hawk set down the notebook. Then, faster than Wade could react, Hawk's fist connected with his jaw. Wade went down hard, tasting blood. Chisel and Gage moved in, hauling Wade to his feet. Hawk stood over him, his pale eyes burning with cold fury. You betrayed your brothers. You put that child at risk. You put Grace at risk, every single one of us. Hawk's voice was soft, deadly. Give me one reason I shouldn't put a bullet in you right now. Wade spit blood on the floor. Because you need what I know, and because I'm willing to wear a wire and get Voss on tape admitting everything. Gavel stepped forward. He's right, Hawk. As much as I want to throw him off a cliff, he's right. With Wade's testimony and his notes, plus the recording Gage got, we can bury Voss. But we need him alive. Hawk grabbed Wade by the front of his shirt and lifted him until they were eye to eye. You wear the wire, you get Voss to confess, and then you disappear. You leave the state, you never come back, and you never use the Hells Angels name again. You're done with this club. Understood? Understood, Wade whispered. Hawk dropped him. Chisel, Gage, watch him. He tries to run, break his legs. Gavel, call your FBI contact. Tell her we're ready to move. Tomorrow night we end this. Friday morning, Grace stood in the county courthouse wearing a borrowed dress, her hands shaking as she waited for the custody hearing to begin. Hawk stood beside her along with Gavel, who was representing her. On the other side of the courtroom, Sheriff Voss sat with a smug smile next to the Child Protective Services lawyer. Judge Marcus Holloway took the bench, a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for favoring law enforcement. Grace felt her hope dying. This was rigged. Voss had bought the judge. She was going to lose Rosie forever. All rise, the bailiff called. The hearing began. The CPS lawyer presented their case. Grace Miller was an unfit mother who had exposed her child to a criminal environment by seeking refuge with a motorcycle club. She had poor judgment, unstable housing, and a history of associating with abusive men. The lawyer recommended permanent removal of the child and termination of parental rights. Grace felt sick. Gavel stood to respond, but before he could speak, the courtroom doors opened. A woman in a gray suit walked in, flanked by two men in FBI windbreakers. She approached the bench and handed Judge Holloway a document. Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have an injunction from Federal District Court halting these proceedings. Sheriff Raymond Voss is under federal investigation for bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. This custody action has been determined to be retaliatory and is therefore suspended pending the outcome of our investigation. The courtroom erupted. Voss was on his feet, his face purple with rage. This is outrageous. You have no jurisdiction here. Actually, Sheriff, we do, Torres said calmly. She nodded to the two agents who approached Voss. Raymond Voss, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Voss tried to pull away, but the agents cuffed him. He looked at Hawk across the courtroom, and his expression was pure hatred. This isn't over, Brennan. I'll destroy you. You already tried, Hawk said quietly. Didn't take. As they led Voss out, Agent Torres approached Grace. Ms. Miller, your daughter is being released from foster care as we speak. She'll be returned to you within the hour. I apologize for what you've been put through. Grace burst into tears, and Hawk put a steady hand on her shoulder. It's okay, he said softly. You won. She's coming home. An hour later at the clubhouse, Rosie ran into Grace's arms, both of them crying and laughing. She hugged her mother fiercely, then turned and ran to Hawk, who scooped her up and held her tight. You kept your promise, Rosie said through her tears. You said you'd get me back. Always keep my promises, kiddo. Hawk said, his voice rough with emotion. That night, the Montana Hells Angels held a celebration at the clubhouse. Music played, beer flowed, and for the first time in months, everyone could breathe easy. But Hawk stepped outside for air, needing a moment alone. He stood in the parking lot, looking up at the stars, thinking about Evelyn, wondering if she could see him, wondering if she'd be proud. Hey, He turned. Grace stood in the doorway, Rosie asleep in her arms. Can we talk? Of course. Grace walked over, adjusting Rosie's weight. I've been thinking about what happens next. The trailer park isn't safe. Dale's still out there somewhere, and even with Voss arrested, I don't trust the system to protect us. What are you asking? Grace took a breath. I'm asking if we can stay here at the clubhouse just until I save enough for a real place, and I'm asking if maybe you'd consider being in Rosie's life, not as a bodyguard or a fake dad, but as someone who cares about her, because she needs that, and I think maybe you do too. Hawk looked at Rosie, asleep and peaceful, then at Grace. I'd like that a lot. Good, Grace said with a small smile, because she's already calling you Dad when she thinks I can't hear. Hawk felt something in his chest crack open, something that had been frozen since Evelyn died. Yeah, he said softly. I know. 3 months later, the dominoes continued to fall. Sheriff Raymond Voss was convicted on 14 federal counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Dale Thornton, facing charges of assault and corruption, took a plea deal and testified against Voss in exchange for 5 years. Judge Holloway was removed from the bench pending an ethics investigation. The land seizure was thrown out, and Blackstone Solutions withdrew from Montana entirely. The Hells Angels kept their clubhouse. Grace got a job managing a local diner that one of the Angels' friends owned, and she saved enough to put a down payment on a small house in town. But 3 nights a week, she and Rosie had dinner at the clubhouse. And every Saturday, Hawk took Rosie riding on the back roads, teaching her about motorcycles and life and what it meant to be brave. One Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the custody hearing, Hawk and Rosie were working on an old Honda dirt bike in the clubhouse garage. Rosie's hands were covered in grease, her tongue stuck out in concentration as she tried to torque a bolt. Like this? She asked. Perfect, Hawk said. You're a natural. Rosie beamed. Then casually, like she was commenting on the weather, she said, Can I ask you something? Shoot. Would you want to adopt me, like for real? Hawk's hand stilled on the wrench he was holding. What? Adopt me? Mom and I talked about it. She said it's okay if you want to. That way you'd be my real dad, not just my friend dad. Rosie looked up at him with those green eyes, hopeful and scared. I know I'm not Evelyn, and I know I can't replace her, but maybe we could be a family anyway. Hawk set down the wrench and knelt beside her, not caring that his jeans were getting soaked in motor oil from the garage floor. Rosie, you could never replace Evelyn, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to be you. And yeah, kiddo, I would very much like to adopt you if you're sure that's what you want. I'm sure, Rosie said. She threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. I love you, Dad. Hawk closed his eyes, and for the first time since Evelyn died, he allowed himself to say it back. I love you too, Rosie. So much. 8 months after that, in the Clearwater County Courthouse, in front of a different judge, August Brennan legally adopted Rose Miller. Grace stood beside them, crying happy tears. 31 Hells Angels filled the courtroom, their cuts traded for suits, their normally gruff faces soft with emotion. When the judge signed the papers and declared Rosie officially Hawk's daughter, the bikers erupted in applause. That night, the clubhouse threw the biggest party in Montana Hells Angels history. There was a massive cake shaped like a motorcycle. There were speeches and toasts and more than a few tears from hardened men who'd never thought they'd see their president smile like that. Rosie wore a new leather vest, child-sized, with a patch that read Property of Hawk on the back. She ran around the clubhouse high on sugar and joy, hugging every angel she passed. Grace stood with Hawk watching their daughter play, and she took his hand. Thank you, she said quietly, for saving us, for giving her a father, for giving us a family. You saved me too, Hawk said. I was dead inside before Rosie showed up. She brought me back to life. They stood there watching Rosie climb onto Chisel's shoulders and demand he take her outside to see the bikes. And Hawk thought about the day a tiny, bruised 8-year-old girl had ridden 5 miles on a broken bike to ask a stranger for help. He thought about how close he'd come to saying no, and he thought about how one act of courage from a desperate child had changed everything. 2 years later, on a bright Saturday morning, Hawk and Rosie rode together on a custom Harley he'd built specifically for the two of them. It had a longer seat, extra foot pegs, and Rose's name painted on the tank in flowing script. They rode through the Montana mountains, the wind whipping past them, the engine roaring beneath them. At a scenic overlook, Hawk pulled over and they climbed off the bike. Rosie was 10, now taller, her auburn hair long and wild. She had lost the haunted look in her eyes, replaced by confidence and joy. She was thriving in school, had friends played soccer. She was a normal, happy kid. Dad, she said, looking out over the valley. Do you think about Evelyn? Every day, Hawk said honestly. Do you think she'd be mad that you adopted me? Hawk knelt down and turned Rosie to face him. I think Evelyn would be happy that I found you. I think she'd be glad I got to be a dad again, and I think she'd love you, Rosie, because you're pretty easy to love. Rosie smiled. I wish I could have met her. Me too. They stood there for a while, father and daughter, looking out over the Montana wilderness. Then Rosie said, "Race you back to the bike." She took off running, and Hawk chased her, both of them laughing. When he caught her, he lifted her up and spun her around, her laughter echoing across the mountains. In that moment, August Brennan understood something fundamental. He'd spent 15 years believing the best parts of him had died with Evelyn, but he'd been wrong. The best parts of him had been waiting dormant for someone to need them again, for a little girl brave enough to ask a scary stranger for help, for a second chance he didn't know he deserved. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about a desperate plea in a roadside diner. Sometimes it's about 32 motorcycles rolling up to an elementary school. Sometimes it's about broken people finding each other and choosing to heal together. And sometimes when you think all the love inside you has died, a fierce little girl with green eyes and more courage than sense reminds you that your heart still works after all. Hawk lifted Rosie onto the motorcycle, climbed on behind her, and started the engine. As they rode back toward Clearwater, toward home, toward the family they'd built from nothing but need and courage and stubborn refusal to give up, Hawk felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt complete. And somewhere in whatever place souls go when bodies give out, a 7-year-old girl with blonde hair and blue eyes smiled, knowing her daddy was going to be okay after all.